I've been preaching patience for the Chicago Bears in free agency, but I'm starting to have some questions about Ryan Poles' approach to building this offensive line.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, hopefully every day. On the show today, we take a look at this Bears offensive line approach thus far. The players they've brought in, the types of players they've brought in, the way it sort of is coming together so far, and whether or not that's been the right approach or what the alternatives could have been, what the plan still could be from here, and use a little bit of hindsight to try and get a sense of, okay, what has been Ryan Poles' thought process so far? What can he still do to kind of redeem the process so far and put together a more competent group around Justin Fields for 2022? Because that's really the impetus of this for me and why I'm ready to start questioning the offensive line decisions a little bit more. I mean, mainly because they signed Dakota Dozier from the Minnesota Vikings, who is just terrible. Like, he's not a good offensive lineman. I was talking to Luke Braun from Locked On Vikings, and he said if he even makes your 53-man roster, then that means you did a bad job of building quality depth on the offensive line. And I said I'm concerned he could be the week one starter at right guard if they don't bring in more offensive guard talent. But for me, the offensive line building is so critically important to the development of Justin Fields, and it doesn't feel like the team has put enough of a priority on talent at that position. We've talked about Lucas Patrick as potentially a good value free agent signing, someone who comes in cheap, has been, when pressed into the starting lineup for Green Bay, was an average starting offensive lineman with good versatility. He's started at both guard spots and center and performed admirably at those spots. And you can say, okay, it's not in a vacuum, that's not a bad addition to bring to your offensive line. But then, you add in Dakota Dozier now, who maybe at most he's a depth signing, and that's not, again, in a vacuum, that's not the end of the world. And now they also put out an offer sheet for Ryan Bates, the guard from the Buffalo Bills, who again has been a bench player for them, who went into the starting lineup at the end of this last season and played very well for 4 or 6 games into the playoffs, whatever it ended up being, but is not a every down quality starting offensive lineman, or at least not proven to be that up to that point. Where again, like in a vacuum, if the Bears can get him on that offer sheet, which the Buffalo Bills have 5 days now to choose whether or not to match it and retain him, he could be another one of these good, like, value type offensive line signings here, who could be a better guard option than Dakota Dozier for sure, and could slide into that right guard spot. But again, you've got a bunch of great value, but you don't have much as far as proven talent. And individually, those can all be, well, not Dakota Dozier, but individually, Lucas Patrick and perhaps Ryan Bates can be good potential signings for an offensive line, but they'd be much better if you had really good players, really solid players around him. And the Bears don't necessarily have that. Tevin Jenkins could very well become a very good player. Larry Borum could very well become a good player. And Cody Whitehair is a good player. He's not a perennial Pro Bowl caliber guard, but he's a fine starting left guard for an NFL offensive line. Yeah, I mean, you can do better, but you're perfectly satisfied with Cody Whitehair as one of your starters. But other than that, you've got relative question marks penciled in your starting lineup at every position. It's still early in the process, and I want to emphasize that too, right? That we have not seen the completion of the Bears' offensive line plan just yet, and we'll get into some of the things towards the end of this podcast of like what they can still do from here, and to maybe find some reasons for things to still pan out particularly well. But as it looks right now, a lot of the best free agent options have come off of the board. And it doesn't leave the Bears a lot to still choose from if they want to still kind of salvage this thing before, we get too deep into this process. Because, it's for me, it's going to be so critically important to have a really good offensive line, or at least a good enough offensive line to help Justin Fields develop. Because, yes, this season, 2022, the Bears have shown you it's clearly not about necessarily winning the Super Bowl this year. It's about building that foundation around Justin Fields to have more long-term success. But you still need to have a good offensive line to develop Justin Fields as much as possible, right? Even if it's not about getting the Super Bowl offensive line together this year, you still need a very good offensive line. I would argue that building the offensive line around Fields is going to be even more important than the wide receivers you put around Fields and the defense you put around Fields. Because at least if you give him some time to throw, if you can at least let him have a platform to throw to receivers, even if they're dropping passes or they're not making plays after the catch, Fields can still develop, right? Everything that happens before the catch is what matters for Fields, and really good wide receivers can make more of the difference after the catch. Yes, you need them to get open, and they're important. They're an important part of the building around Fields and developing him process. I just think if we're ranking what's going to be the most important after the coaching staff, it's got to be the offensive line. And this good value, low risk approach can be a good thing, but it doesn't seem like it's the best thing for what you have with Justin Fields right this second. And it feels like it either hasn't been the right priority, or, I'm not exactly sure what the plan is or why the Bears have gone about it this way, whether they potentially misjudged the market or whether, they thought Larry Ogunjobi was going to cost $13 million, and so they didn't think they'd have enough cap space for some of these players, but then Ogunjobi fails his physical, and now they had more cap space, but then a lot of these players are off the market. If that affected how things go, but instead, it's been the much more cheaper, low-risk approach to free agency. Not that free agency is purely the end-all, be-all approach to the offensive line, but it is a part of this process. There were also some potential trade opportunities in there the Bears did not take up. So we'll kind of look at, okay, what have they missed out on? How could they have gone about this differently and maybe found some better options at even some more affordable prices than the top of the market guys? Next on Locked On Bears. The college basketball tournament is getting down to the final 8 teams. The excitement is turning up, and hey, you can make these games even more exciting. Put some real stakes on them with bets through our friends at BetOnline. Even if you don't have a connection to the teams, working with BetOnline.net to get all the latest contests, odds, and player props can give you a little more juice and have a little bit more meaning in these games other than just watching them on TV with your friends. BetOnline.net is the #1 source for all of your sports betting needs and information. Your scores, your podcasts, your news, and everything else. Not just for college basketball, but off-season football, NFL draft, free agency odds, plus baseball season right around the corner, hockey, soccer, tennis, boxing, UFC, even your favorite Vegas casino games online, all with betonline.net. Head on over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. For me, the Chicago Bears offensive line concerns, it's not about not signing Teron Armstead, who I know a lot of Bears fans were high on trying to bring in the Saints offensive tackle who signed with the Dolphins for $15 million a year. Or Brandon Scherf, right, from the Washington Commanders, goes to the Jaguars for $16.5 million a year, right? For me, it wasn't about oh no, the Bears missed out on the very top guys. Whatever are they going to do on this offensive line? No, for me, it was more about even just the next tier of guys, or at least just getting consistent starting offensive linemen with experience, really experience more than anything else. Some of these guys have been up and down at times in their career, but at least they have some snaps under their belt to be able to go to this group, to the young guys that you already have, and potentially the rookies you might bring in and say, okay, I've been through this before and can give some kind of some more stability on that offensive line and be a little bit less of a question mark. That even if you're not signing Pro Bowlers across the board, at least you know what you're getting with some of these veterans that maybe they have been inconsistent, but at least the level of inconsistency you're going to get compared to the guys the Bears have brought in that haven't been full-time starters throughout their careers and are a little bit more of a question mark of like, what is Lucas Patrick going to give you? What might, if they sign Ryan Bates, if they end up getting Ryan Bates, what is Ryan Bates going to give you? What is Dakota Dozier going to give you? And even the young guys, what are Tevin Jenkins and Larry Borum going to give you? There's perhaps more upside there, but there's also more risk and more downside to not having a good offensive line, because that seems more like the worst case scenario for me, is like not having a good offensive line. I would rather like slightly overpay to have a decent offensive line that helps Justin Fields develop than get a good deal but end up with a really weak spot because one of those good value players didn't really end up panning out. Like, I understand not wanting to get in a bidding war. Like a guy like Laken Tomlinson goes from the 49ers to the Jets, the guard, for like over $13 million a year. That was an overpay, and I'm okay with sitting something like that out. But there were other guys that fell into a couple of different tiers, some more expensive than others, some perhaps greater overpays than others, that I would have liked to see the Chicago Bears either pay that amount that they got or at least be more reportedly in that conversation. Like, for example, the Bears were reportedly pursuing right tackle Chukwuma Okorafor from the Pittsburgh Steelers, who ultimately re-signed with the Pittsburgh Steelers, 3 years, just over $29 million a year. He's the right tackle, almost $10 million a year. And reportedly, the Bears didn't want to pay up the $10 million a year for Okorafor. And like, in a vacuum, yeah, that's probably too much for Chukwuma Okorafor. He's, an average-ish starting right tackle, and $10 million a year is probably a bit rich for him. But, you look around the offensive tackle market, and there were other options that are nearly as good for less money, right? I think Trent Brown from the Patriots was testing the market quite a bit, and then just last night re-signed, or just recently re-signed with the Patriots. It was reported a 2-year, $13 million deal, which would be $6.5 million a year, but with incentives up to 2 years, $22 million, which would be $11 million a year, which is a little bit more expensive, but overall it was a low guaranteed money, and the incentives kind of protect the Patriots and say, okay, if Trent Brown is injured or doesn't play well, then they don't have to pay him as much, and they would still only pay him $6.5 million a year, which is really darn good for a tackle of Trent Brown's caliber. And if he plays well, he gets $11 million a year for those 2 years and earns it, right? I mean, if he played well, then he'd be worth the $11 million a year. And in any of these cases, and maybe Brown specifically re-signing with the Patriots, maybe the Bears never stood a chance. Maybe they were interested, and for whatever reason, he didn't want to play for the Bears or only wanted to re-sign with the Patriots, or for whatever reason, like with any of these free agents, it's too easy to assume, well, why didn't the Bears sign player X? They should have signed player X for that money. And sometimes players have different motivations. And for this entire list, you can't say unanimously that the Bears could have had these players at that price. But if you start making a list of, I've got 10 or so players out there, it seems like the Bears could have had at least one, which seems like a pretty reasonable ask that they could have gotten potentially one of these guys, right? You look around and say, okay, La'el Collins was cut from the Dallas Cowboys, goes to the Bengals, 3 years, $20 million, low guaranteed money. That's my quick math in my head says it's just under $7 million a year, but the low guaranteed money makes him really easy to cut if he has injury problems or doesn't pan out. So you're relatively protected there, and just under $7 million is a good value for a really solid starting right tackle. Again, probably would want to play for the Bengals over the Bears, a team that was just in the Super Bowl versus a team that's doing this half transition rebuild. Understandable that maybe the Bears weren't in play there, but otherwise Morgan Moses goes from the Jets to the Ravens for 3 years and $15 million. Or even a former Bear, Cornelius Lucas, played pretty well for the Washington Commanders. Had eventually been a bench player in Chicago, came off the bench, started, and then a couple years now in Washington has done decently well. 2 years, $8 million comes back to the Commanders. I think that would have been a good value play for the Bears potentially. A lot more of these guards too, right? Even James Daniels goes for 3 years, $26 million, just under $9 million, just under $9 million a year for him. Austin Corbett from the Rams to the Cardinals goes for $326, same price range, just under $9 million a year. Alex Kappa from the Buccaneers to the Bengals, 4 years, $30 $35 million is, again, just under that $9 million a year range, seemed to be the going price for that second tier of offensive guards. And maybe you didn't want, and I wasn't even super crazy about re-signing James Daniels at a huge price, but like any of those guys would be more consistency at right guard, where it just seems to be that much more important when you're building this offensive line around Justin Fields. Even if you don't want to pay that $9 million mark, you go down a little bit cheaper. Connor Williams goes from the Dallas Cowboys to the Miami Dolphins, 2 years, $14 million. $7 million a year is not too bad for a quality, not a Pro Bowler, but a quality offensive guard with the right kind of scheme fit, athletic mover that Ryan Poles is looking for this Bears offensive line. Or Andrew Norwell goes from the Jaguars to the Commanders, 2 years, $10 million. It's $5 million a year, not bad. Mark Lewinsky goes from the Colts, Matt Eberflus's Colts, to the Giants for 3 years, $18 million, $6 million a year. Not a super impressive offensive lineman, but just like someone with some experience. The Bears have been going kind of younger, and I get that for a rebuild, but if you're talking about long-term future, right? Norwell's 30, Glowinski's 29. We talked about, I think, Trent Brown earlier is like approaching 30. Even if you sign a 30-year-old, he should still be good for 3 years, at least 2 to 3 years. So it's not just like these veterans that are 1 year castaway guys. And even if they were, right, that's leadership and that's development that you can then eventually still replace as you build your team up. So it just seems like there were good options. They didn't all cost a fortune, and the Bears still opted to kind of go cheap and value. It doesn't mean all hope is lost for the offensive line. And A, it still could work out. And B, there are still options that the Bears could pursue in free agency. And then there's also the NFL draft. We'll look at what's sort of left and how the Bears might try and approach it from here next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears brought to you by the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars, Built Bars. And they really are the best tasting protein bars out there. I have tried a number of different protein bar products on the market, and I haven't found anything that tastes quite as good as a Built Bar, and certainly doesn't taste as good or is as good for you. Built Bar is that 1-2 punch, because every flavor of Built Bar is low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. Not to mention soft, easy to chew, and covered in 100% real chocolate. I just placed a reorder, or actually a new order, for a box of brownie batter flavored Built Puffs, and I'm telling you what, it sounds like the most, I haven't tried this yet, it's brand new, but it sounds like the most delicious combination yet. You got to try them for yourself. Head on over to built.com and enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to save 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. I've been trying to preach patience here with the Bears offensive line plan and free agency in general. And so I'm hesitant to be like, ringing all the alarms and throwing Ryan Poles under the bus or anything, right? I'm not trying to, I do still want to hear him out, right? I'm not saying he's a terrible GM and has no idea what he's doing and is ruining this offensive line. He is a former offensive lineman himself. And there are still free agents out there to turn this around. There still are NFL draft prospects that can work out, and there's still a chance that everybody that they signed so far, that maybe they get Ryan Bates and he plays really well, and Lucas Patrick plays really well, and the rookies from last year, Jenkins and Borum, step in and take another step, and all of a sudden you have a really good, young, cheap offensive line that all works out well for Justin Fields. That's all a possibility, but I tend to think they're going to need to at least bring in one more free agent and plus at least a draft pick or so, and kind of fill in the last few holes on this offensive line and add some more depth. When I look around free agency, it's definitely drying up. It's definitely on the older side. The name I've got kind of circled as the top option that jumps out to me right now is Darrell Williams from the Buffalo Bills. They released him as a salary cap casualty for them recently. He started at guard for them, and he started at right tackle. I think he's always been better at right tackle, but that positional versatility helps out for the Bears when you kind of have Larry Borum, who could play either spot too, and you kind of bring in the two of them and figure out how you'd like that combination to go, and maybe if you get to the draft and there's a guard that you like, then you could put Williams at tackle, or if there's a tackle that you like, you could put Williams at guard. And he's still only 29, so you sign him to a multi-year deal. He can be more of a longer-term piece for this offensive line, and I think would be a welcomed upgrade to that right side. He would be kind of the top of my wish list. I'm just not sure what the price will be for him or what his status might be moving forward. Otherwise, it's like Dwayne Brown from the Seahawks, but he's 36. So that's a little bit on the old side for where the Bears are right now. I still think there's value to having an old offensive lineman, much like Jason Peters provided last year. It's just like a veteran who knows the game and can mentor these young players, kind of like we were touching on earlier. But again, price tag for Brown might be an interesting question there. I also keep an eye on Eric Fisher because, he was the Colts left tackle for the last few seasons with Matt Eberflus. And, of course, before that, the Kansas City Chiefs with Ryan Poles. He's 31, not terribly old, not terribly young, but in theory, you could at least get a good 2 more years, if not a good 4 more years out of Eric Fisher. And obviously, there could be a decline there, and he's not a every year Pro Bowl type offensive tackle, but you could put him at left tackle, put Tevin Jenkins at right tackle, and feel a little bit more solidified at those 2 spots, or even put Eric Fisher at right tackle, I suppose. I'd also throw Riley Reif out there. He played with the Bengals last season, the Vikings for a little while before that, and I think the Lions earlier in his career. He was injured last season, and so I'm not sure health-wise what his status is. He's also 33, so he's not a long-term piece. But again, 1 or 2 years, veteran stability, develop the younger guys behind him, give them some leadership in that line. Why not? I like it better than the options that they have right now, because like outside of them, it's like Jermaine Ifedi's still out there, Bobby Massey still out there, but they don't seem to fit the mold of the type of offensive lineman Ryan Poles seems to be looking for. Otherwise, like if you're looking for another guard, Trey Turner from the Steelers, he's only 28, but he's been kind of, mediocre. So if the price is right, sure, but I wouldn't be paying market value for a guy like Trey Turner because he's not that great. He's fine, but then otherwise it's like draft a rookie early. You don't want to go into the NFL draft feeling like, okay, we have to get an offensive lineman with one of our 2 second-round picks because we need a week 1 starter. And plus, when you're drafting a rookie, you're not getting that experience. There's going to be a learning curve. And it's another one of these sort of question marks where it's like, yeah, he could be a plug-and-play week 1 starter who it looks like a solid starter as a rookie and is a starter for his 4 years and gets a big second contract and works out great. Or the NFL transition could be really hard for him and could be inconsistent and all these different just possibilities, right? I think the more experience and the more veteran consistency you can bring in, the less unpredictability there is. And I think for Justin Fields, some predictability on the offensive line can go a long way for that development. And that's why it's so important. And because it's so important, that's why I'm willing to just kind of at least wonder, are the Bears taking the right approach on the offensive line? Have they misjudged the market? Do they have a greater plan that we just still need to be more patient for? Again, I'm willing to see where it goes from here, but I'm just starting to raise the eyebrow a little bit, starting to question it a little bit. And again, am I just being too impatient? I'm willing to see them out because if they could sign Darrell Williams at one spot and maybe bring in a rookie, and all of a sudden, okay, maybe they sign Ryan Bates and Darrell Williams, and all of a sudden they've got some good starters, they've got some good depth, they've got some good value, and they've got some younger players. Okay. That looks like an offensive line plan I can get behind and have some confidence in. But the options are getting smaller and smaller, and it feels more and more like they missed out on some affordable options and some less, some more affordable, but some very good options for some multiple different spots that, for whatever reason, they weren't able to pull the trigger. And I don't know how much of that was the Ogunjobi stuff versus other free agents they were going after or misjudging the market or whatever it might be, but I'm nervous. How about that? I'm nervous about the Bears' offensive line until further notice, and I think it's just too critically important to go cheap and to go value on when developing Justin Fields needs to be the number 1 priority, even if winning the Super Bowl isn't quite this year. If they make some offensive line changes, if they bring in another free agent or make a trade, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. Should be in the clear now from the sickness I was dealing with the last couple of days. Appreciate you tuning back in after a couple of days off. I hope you hit that subscribe button to keep up with the Locked On Bears podcast, normally 5 days a week, wherever you get your podcasts. Appreciate you making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. If you're looking for your second listen, the Locked On Podcast Network has your team every day. Locked On Bulls getting closer to the playoffs. Locked On Cubs, Locked On White Sox getting you ready for baseball season. Locked On Blackhawks in the thick of the NHL season as well. And of course, Locked On Bears has your Bears coverage every day. So of course, I hope that listening to Locked On Bears podcast helps make it a little bit easier for you to bear down.